The Settlers of Catan is a board game for 3 to 4 people with a playing time of approximately 75 minutes. It was published by Cosmos. First of all, Catan must be built. To do this, the C parts are first put together. These pieces have a number depicted in the corners. 5 must be 5, 1 must be 1, and so on. The hexagonal land parts then find their place on Catan. The order now shown here is the recommended starting lineup. You can just as easily mix up the landscape tiles randomly and place them randomly. But this is only recommended for advanced players. The desert is positioned in the middle of Catan. Which tiles stand for what will of course be explained in more detail later. Now the round tiles with numbers on them are distributed on the landscape tiles. Here too, the following list is the recommended one for beginners. Alternatively, you could turn these over, sort them alphabetically and start laying them out at any point in sequence. The desert remains free here. The robbers can now be positioned on the desert. The 2 dice are laid out and the raw materials are placed on the edge of the table, easily accessible to everyone. Catan has different types of landscapes that produce different raw materials. Hills produce clay, mountains produce ore, farmland produces grain, pasture produces wool, and forest produces wood. The desert does not produce any raw materials, more on this later in the game. The remaining cards that do not show resources are development cards. The 2 special cards, longest trade route and largest night power, can also be found their place at the edge of the table. And then each player receives a construction cost overview card. The next step is to roll the dice to see who the starting player is. The player with the highest number rolled starts. Each player receives all game pieces of one color. These consist of streets, settlements, and cities in white, blue, yellow, and red. The starting player then positions a settlement and an adjacent street on Catan. The next player does the same. However, there are rules to follow when building settlements. The next settlement or later city must be at least 2 spaces away. That wouldn't be allowed. It's the next player's turn, and now also the 4th. Now another settlement and another road is being built, starting with the player who last laid one down. And now there are already the first raw material yields. For the second settlement built, each player receives the adjacent raw materials. The players hold the respective resource cards face down in their hands. And then the game can begin. It is played clockwise. The player whose turn it is has various actions they can take. First of all, both dice are rolled. This causes resource yields to be rolled out for all players. For each player who has a settlement or a city adjacent to a landscape world, the corresponding number now receives raw materials. Each settlement receives one of the corresponding raw materials. Next, the active player can act. Either you trade directly with another player. You do this by making a direct offer. For example, I trade wool twice for ore once. Or you can exchange directly with the bank. The exchange rate here is basically 4 to 1. This means that a player has to exchange 4 identical types of raw materials for 1. But be careful, if a player owns a settlement at a port location, you can trade cheaper. Here for example 3 to 1, or like here 2 specific species against 1. The next step is now to start building. The respective costs are noted here on this map. As we already know, there are roads, settlements, cities, and development maps. Each settlement a player owns counts for 1 victory point. Cities count for 2 victory points. By the way, on a player's turn, he can convert his settlements into cities. To do this, the required raw materials must be paid for and the settlement is then exchanged with a city. Cities not only provide 2 victory points, but also 2 resources that can be rolled. The goal in Catan is to be the first player to gain 10 or more victory points. However, in order to be able to build settlements, there are a few requirements that must be met. First of all, of course, you have to have the appropriate raw materials. In addition, a new settlement can only be built if at least 2 road elements are away from the next one. So you could build one here. This applies to both your own and third-party settlements or cities. The raw materials used are then given directly to the bank. Development cards contain a wide variety of actions. As soon as you have one of these, you can play it at any time during your turn. However, this cannot be the card bought in the same round. After a player has carried out all of their actions, it is the next player's turn. He rolls the dice again. Normally, the players receive the raw materials they roll. However, with the 7 the robbers come into play. All players who have more than 7 resource cards in their hand choose half of them and put them back in the supply. Odd numbers are rounded down. Then the player who rolled the dice must relocate the robbers. He places it on another land space and then steals it from another player. A settlement or city on the land space has a resource card. This is drawn face down. The player whose turn it is then continues his turn. So now he can trade and build again. If, for example, 8 is rolled here later in the game and the robbers are currently on it, these players do not receive any raw materials from it at that moment. The development cards include knights. A player who was the first to reveal 3 knight cards in front of him receives the largest 1 knight power and thus 2 additional victory points. And the player who first built 5 contiguous streets owns it, the longest trade route, and receives this card and thus 2 victory points. Be careful, these cards can be outbid by other players at any time. As soon as a player achieves 10 or more victory points, the game ends. If you like this video, please leave a thumbs up and feel free to subscribe this channel. Thank you for watching.